This video is sponsored by Incogni. The beauty of strongman is in its purity. You can have a sport like basketball or baseball and think to yourself, yeah, but in the end, what's the point? To entertain, to profit? Is the ball jumping through hoops? So am I. But in strongman, the whole idea is crystal clear. I want to be the strongest person to ever exist. You might argue that Tyson in his prime could beat Ali, or that LeBron would have beaten Mike in 1v1, or you think that you have to judge a competitor against the competition of the time. The good news is that in strongman, there's no argument. How big of a rock did your favorite guy lift? Yeah, well, my favorite guy lifted a bigger one, case closed. A problem with other sports is that a lot of them require a lot of skill, but people won't know unless they see you do it. You can be the best skater in the world, but unless you're at the skate park or thrift shop, no one's going to have any idea. But if you're 6'9", 400 pounds, and cause the plane to list to one side on takeoff, people are going to say, hey, is that Hafthor Bjornsson? And your lifetime of struggle will have been worth it for that moment of validation. Even the names of the world's strongest men sound powerful. Hafthor Bjornsson, Zydrunas Savickas, Alexei Novikov, Magnus Ver Magnusson, Martins Licis, Mateusz Kielikowski, and of course Brian, which I pronounce perfectly on account of my English language abilities. The great thing about strongman is you don't even need a reference point to understand how good these athletes are. Every guy watching MMA or boxing always thinks they could land a punch or two on Floyd Mayweather, or maybe even knock him out with their lucky haymaker. But when you watch strongman, you have to say, admittedly, I probably couldn't do that one, as you nervously glance at your wife to make sure she's not leaving you. Strongman competitions have their roots in many historical tests of strength, from Scottish Highland Games to feats of strength by circus strongmen, and even going back to ancient Greek mythology when Sisyphus was punished by Zeus to endlessly push a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down as he reached the top. The story goes that every morning he would wake up, inhale 2 scoops of creatine, huff some ammonia, watch a Larry Wheels video, and get ready to smash a new PR, bringing joy and meaning to his otherwise tedious and wasteful life. Similarly, one of the hallmarks of strongman are the Atlas stones, named after the Greek titan Atlas, who is often depicted holding up the heavens and earth on his shoulders. While we now know it's actually just turtles all the way down, at the time the concept was quite inspirational. The 80s were when strongman first became popular as an actual sport, creating legends like Bill Kazmaier, John Paul Sigmarsson, and a host of iconic strongmen that caused many to consider this the first golden age of the sport. Prior to this, strongman featured a ragtag group of strength sports athletes competing on the side of their main gigs, and the World's Strongest Man organizers still thought it would be a good idea that instead of using weights, they put a couple girls in cages, attach them to a bar, and have an event called the Girl Lift. While culture has moved on since then, it's only with hindsight we're now able to realize how fucked up it was to ask a girl what she weighs. During the 80s, organizers, realizing that women were real people and not physical objects whose only purpose was to be lifted for as many repetitions as possible, tried instead to objectify the men, ensuring everyone had the shortest shorts possible, and for a brief period introduced sumo into strongman, where the legendary strongman Bill Kazmaier basically scared his opponents into giving up. While events like sumo were quickly thrown out because even though it provided the much-needed boost to strongman's sex appeal, it was simultaneously when Mr. Olympia had fully transitioned from posing trunks to posing thongs, canceling the extra viewership potential and creating one of the most popular hobbies for straight men ever since. Bill Kazmaier was the man who dominated strongmen in the early 80s. He won World's Strongest Man in 1980, 81, 82, and then the organizers banned him from participating for essentially being too good. While I'm suspicious of that narrative because it doesn't make any sense, I'm going to run with it because it upholds my fantasy. He was athletic, an elite powerlifter, and all around built for strongman. One of the greats of strongman in the 80s and a rival to Bill Kazmaier was John Paul Sigmarsson, who won World's Strongest Man 4 times and was famous for doing a 1,005-pound axle deadlift and exclaiming, "There's no reason to be alive if you can't do deadlifts." He then died later doing deadlifts. If you think I'm giving you the perfect layup to write a pun in the comments, you will regret it in Valhalla. Nevertheless, despite great competition in the 80s, strongman as a sport in and of itself spent most of this decade and the next lost in an identity crisis trying to figure out what kind of sport it was and what really made a man strong. Was it his mind? Was it his heart? Or was it being able to lift a 345-pound tree trunk above your head? No one truly knew for some reason, and strongman fell into a competitive lull. Other than having arm wrestling that ended how every popular arm wrestling clip usually does, the 90s were an overall boring time for strongman, as more important things were taking up people's time, attention, and money. I was being born without my permission, the internet was being called a fad by Nobel Prize-winning economists, capital investment was pouring into children's cartoons, cereal advertisements, and anything to sell mass-manufactured products to Western millennials with an exorbitant markup. While all of these pieces of plastic were fucking awesome, it wasn't the time or place to lift heavy things. But the time was soon to come. In the early 2000s, strongman was still somewhat dormant, but re-emerging from hibernation, where the only person winning things because of rules around international competition and lack of anyone really being all that good was Mariusz Pudzianowski, who admittedly was the first strongman ever who wasn't quite as statically strong, but was really fast and had great endurance on account of being jacked out of his goddamn mind. While he is one of the most athletic and decorated strongmen in history, popularized the sport immensely because everyone thought, well, why isn't he really fat? And maybe one of the best strongmen ever, pound for pound, I will reiterate that the spirit of strongman, where our hearts and souls have always been, is who can lift the biggest rock. And he did not usually lift the biggest rock. And so in the eyes of many observers of the sport, we all thought, nah, I wouldn't choose him as the best strongman ever, but this is of course how I would look if I tried strongman. With this new popularization of World's Strongest Man and a shift in marketing due to internet popularity, many event changes occurred, shifting from somewhat heavy things done quickly to extremely heavy things done some of the time. And after 2008, when everyone's leveraged CLOs went tits up, it was obvious to most men that if you couldn't get rich, you might as well get strong. And we had a well-rounded and dynamic international competition where Zydrunas Savickas established himself as arguably the greatest strongman of all time. He was immensely statically strong, known particularly for his overhead press, but more importantly, he ultimately cemented an image in our collective brain cells of what a strongman looks like. A regular tall fat guy, but with a weightlifting belt. As Big Z moved towards retirement in the mid-2010s, he ushered in the peak of what has been called the era of the Giants, where the likes of Brian Shaw and Hafthor Bjornsson, 6'8" and 6'9" respectively, became the focus of the sport, along with Eddie Hall, who is instead about 6'8" in circumference. Most strongmen historically have been about 6'3", barely qualifying them for Tinder, and the challenge of these new height differentials meant that one of the most important factors in any strongman competition would be what the events were going to be, because generally speaking, any event where you needed to move something along the y-axis, like deadlift or overhead press, would favor hydraulic refrigerators like Eddie Hall, while events that required weight, leverage, or grip advantages like the Fingal's Fingers, truck pull, or the keg toss would favor the even bigger boys. The Giants era was really a new golden age of hype around if these new human blueprints were going to destroy all previously known limits. And while Brian Shaw dominated for several years through overall well-roundedness, near the end of this era it ultimately became more a pursuit of breaking world records in specific categories. Eddie only won World's Strongest Man once, then said, fuck this, I'm going to be the first person ever to deadlift 1,100 pounds. Hafthor also won World's Strongest Man once, then said, I'm the guy who launched Pedro Pascal's career, I'm going to lift this tree, then I'm going to deadlift exactly 1 kilo more than Eddie. This annoyed Eddie, and they of course settled the dispute the only way that makes sense. Taking the obvious next step, all three of them are now YouTubers. Since the end of their rivalry in the late 2010s, we began the modern era of strongman, which seems to be the age of specialization. While everyone wants the title of World's Strongest Man, especially me, focusing on individual records is much more practical. Guys like Tom Stoltman, who is himself 6'8", has mastered the art of lifting the biggest rock over a bar. Mateusz Kielikowski has mastered the art of lifting the biggest rock onto your shoulder, and Eddie Hall has mastered lifting the biggest rock for the most ad revenue. Guys like Martins Licis seems to just be doing his own thing. Despite there still being healthy competition, the biggest debate in strongman is the direction the sport is going in. While the last World's Strongest Man was won by my fellow Canadian and time traveler Mitchell Hooper, event selection still is the determining factor in most strongman contests. I think that a good way to address biased event selection is create events where the weight and what you're supposed to do with it is standardized, but the shape of the weight is not revealed until the day of the event. This allows athletes to prepare for the event, but not specialize specifically for the task. For example, you could have the small rock, the big rock, medium rock for reps, rock toss, rock pull. Really, the options are endless. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Now, while you may not be able to be a strong man, you might be interested in being a safe man with today's sponsor, Incogni. As someone who doesn't get many calls, nor would I answer them if I did, my voicemail is almost entirely spam, whether it's telemarketers, robocalls, my dad, or scammers. Even when I kindly request they stop calling me, they still manage to get my email somehow. This is because data brokers collect your information and hold them in a commercial database, which is not only vulnerable to a breach, but they can sell that data to other businesses and it might fall in the hands of some sketchy people. This isn't just your phone number and email, but can include your address, social insurance number, and more. Incogni works by requesting on your behalf the removal of your personal data directly from data brokers, and then will automatically continue to follow up and make further communication until the request is successful. The thing that I was genuinely impressed by is the entire process took me literally 60 seconds. You make an account, check out a plan, and then I thought, okay, here comes the big form I have to fill out. But instead it just says 278 requests initiated. And then after thinking for a second, I was like, oh yeah, right, that makes sense. Because there are so many commercial databases, even requesting removal manually might take years, but doing it repeatedly to catch newly collected data is practically impossible. Incogni will do this automatically and actively reports all successful and active requests. If you'd like to check it out, the first 100 people to use the code CASUALLY at the link in the description below will get 60% off their subscription.